Well, Brian Beary, Washington-based journalist, EU expert and contributing editor to European Affairs magazine, joins me now to dig a little deeper into the topic. Welcome.
Thank you, Rachelle.
Now, as we heard there from the European Council President, the UK won't be able to pick and choose which freedoms it gets to enjoy. So with that being said, how will that decision affect the UK labour market?
It's very unclear because this has never happened before where a country had to negotiate its way out of the EU. Before this, we had countries like Poland negotiating their way into the EU, where they were given 6 or 7 years before their nationals could have full access. Interestingly, the British didn't use those waivers, and they allowed the Polish workers to come in straight away. And there's upwards of 1 million there. One suspects that the British government will not even try to have them leave because they're predominantly young people who work and contribute a lot to the British economy. In fact, they have a higher rate of working and contribution than the overall British population. So one doubts that greatly that there'll be any push for them to be pushed out, so to speak. But of course, in theory, once Brexit happens, they are not British citizens for the most part, and so they lose the right and the privilege to work in the UK.
And with that being said, as we broaden it out to the labour markets within the EU, what do you think the fallout will be there then?
85% of the population, it's worth noting that the fallout would be less in the sense that, you know, you're talking about a couple of million, maybe British people who want to work in a market that will have maybe more than 400 million people that are remaining in the EU. And having said that, I mean, if I would look at it more as if I was a British person trying to get a job in the EU, it could throw some spanners in the works because you may have to apply for a work permit. And even if you don't, how will employers view you if you're British and they know that, you know, there's this big question mark over whether you'll have access to the labour market? So I think that British citizens will have more to worry about, frankly.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, doubt. So this is looking at, like, we don't know what the future is going to hold.
Right. If you have, you know, a German and a British applicant who are equally well qualified, and there's a question mark about you might have to get a work permit for the British one, well, why wouldn't you just hire the German one?
And it's true, and obviously people are going to be looking at some of these expenses. Now, something else let's look at. Let's look at border controls, which could potentially be affected. Give us an idea of some of the ones that could benefit the most and some that could potentially be hurt the most.
Are you speaking about border controls on people or on goods? Or
on goods.
On goods. So the one that's often trotted out is Germany exports a lot of cars, great BMWs, etc., to the UK. And the EU Trade Commissioner has said there'll be a Brexit, and then the UK will lose all of its access to the market, and then they will have to negotiate a free trade deal. So that's potentially problematic, say, for a German exporter of cars or a Dutch. The Netherlands exports a lot of food to the UK. On the other hand, the big loser could well be City of London because the banks and financial services industry will not want to lose what they call their EU financial passport. And the only way they can do that is to move to a country that is still in the EU, be it Germany, be it Ireland. So the British financial services industry could take a hit from this.
Now, one thing that we should also look at, there were a lot of numbers thrown around about the amount of taxes that UK citizens pay when it comes to contributing to the European Union. How will the EU countries lose out? How much will they lose out on by not having these UK taxes? And then who does the burden shift to then to make up that difference?
Well, Britain was a net contributor to the EU budget, although it's worth pointing out there is no EU income tax. So it's just a case of once a year the British government writing a big check. And so there would be some loss to the EU budget as a whole. On the other hand, pockets of the British economy do very well from the EU budget. For example, in the university sector, because research is distributed by EU-wide programs, and Britain gets a disproportionate amount of research funding. And so I know personally people in universities that are very worried about losing out. Of course, some British farmers will lose out because they'll get their subsidies revoked. So it'll be a bit of a mixed bag, really.
Now, one thing I do want to get to is a lot of people are talking about the Brexit fallout, and some people are saying it could be a little premature because of Article 50, which is the mechanism for actually triggering this EU exit, and it requires an act of Parliament. So is Brexit really a done deal at this point?
No, in a word, the referendum has no legal effect because there's very little referendum tradition in the UK, and Parliament is supreme. And so if and when the Parliament decides to recognise and endorse the referendum result, then Article 50 gets triggered, and then the clock starts ticking. And within 2 years, if there's no deal or no extension of that 2-year time frame, Britain is out, period. But it requires the British Parliament to take a conscious decision to invoke Article 50.
And obviously something hard to do to go against the will of the people. Unfortunately, we'll have to leave it there. Brian Beary, journalist and contributing editor to European Affairs magazine. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Rachelle.